I'm Emma, 31, and my husband Lucas, 33, and I just had our first baby, Noah. I knew childbirth would be challenging, but nothing prepared me for the whirlwind of emotions. The hours felt endless, but when I held Noah for the first time, everything else faded. The exhaustion, the pain, it all melted away in that perfect moment. Lucas was beside me, his smile brighter than I'd ever seen. I thought we were stepping into this new chapter together, ready for whatever came next. But things changed in ways I never expected. The first days at home were a blur. Lucas was just as sleep-deprived as I was, and we were stumbling through the chaos of having a newborn. At first, I didn't think too much about how distant he seemed from Noah. I was doing most of the feedings, and Lucas kept himself busy with chores around the house. When I asked why he hadn't held Noah yet, he brushed it off, saying he was scared he might drop him. Noah was so tiny, and I could see the fear in Lucas's eyes. I didn't push. I remembered how nervous I was the first time I held him. But as the days turned into a week, I noticed something unsettling. Lucas wasn't just avoiding holding Noah. He wasn't connecting with him at all. He'd make excuses. His hands were dirty, he was too tired, or Noah was already settled with me. I kept telling myself he just needed time. Still, there was this growing gap between us. I felt like I was carrying all the weight alone. Diapers, feeding, soothing Noah while he cried. While Lucas stayed in the background, more focused on his phone or disappearing into the garage. One night, I found Lucas standing in Noah's room, staring at the crib. He looked pale, like he'd seen a ghost. When I asked if he was okay, he snapped at me, a side of him I'd never seen before. He stormed out without saying another word. That's when I began to worry. This wasn't just exhaustion or the typical stress of new parenthood. Something deeper was going on. I confided in my best friend Chloe. She has 2 kids and always seems to know what to do. When I told her about Lucas's behavior, she mentioned something I'd never considered: postpartum depression in men. I'd only ever heard about mothers struggling after childbirth, but it made sense. Lucas wasn't himself, and he seemed so anxious and withdrawn, especially around Noah. Desperate for answers, I spent hours online reading stories from other parents. I found posts about dads who didn't bond with their babies right away, and the challenges of postpartum anxiety. Some of them overcame it with time and support. It gave me hope that Lucas could too. When I brought up the idea of counseling, though, Lucas shut me down. He said I was making a big deal out of nothing and just needed to give him time. But as the days went on, the distance between us grew. He barely looked at Noah and spent more and more time in the garage or buried in work. One night, after hours of trying to calm a crying Noah alone, I hit my breaking point. I marched into the garage and demanded answers. "Why won't you hold your son? Why are you leaving everything to me?" I asked, my voice trembling with exhaustion and frustration. Lucas just stood there, silent. When he finally spoke, it wasn't anger, it was emptiness. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, and then he turned away. That moment confirmed what I'd been dreading. This wasn't just fear or hesitation. There was something deeper holding Lucas back, and I didn't know if I could help him alone. After that night in the garage, I couldn't stop thinking about Lucas's words or the way he had said them. He wasn't angry or annoyed, he just seemed lost, and that terrified me more than anything. I tried to be patient, hoping things would shift naturally, but the distance only grew wider. Lucas spent even less time at home, working late or disappearing into the garage for hours. When he was around, it was like he wasn't really there. He barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was surface-level stuff, how work was going or what bills needed to be paid. He avoided talking about Noah entirely. It wasn't just the physical distance, it was emotional too. Every time I looked at Lucas, I saw a man I barely recognized. The guy who used to be so excited about starting a family now seemed like a stranger living in the same house as me. I started to feel like I was doing everything alone, because, well, I was. I remember one night vividly. Noah wouldn't stop crying, and I was so tired I thought I might collapse. I sat in the nursery rocking him back and forth, my own tears streaming down my face. I felt so alone, and all I wanted was for Lucas to come in, take Noah from me, and tell me we were in this together. But he never did. When I finally went to find him, he was sitting in the garage scrolling through his phone, completely disconnected. I wanted to scream, but I didn't have the energy. The next day, I decided I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. I called Chloe, desperate for advice. She told me I needed to confront Lucas again, but this time from a place of understanding instead of frustration. She reminded me that whatever he was going through, it likely wasn't about me or Noah. It was about him. "You've got to get to the root of it," she said. "Otherwise, you're just spinning in circles." So that evening, after Noah finally went down for the night, I sat Lucas down in the living room. I didn't yell or demand answers this time. Instead, I said, "I'm worried about you. You're not yourself, and I don't know how to help you." At first, he wouldn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the floor, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Finally, he muttered, "I don't think I can do this." "Do what?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Be a dad," he said, his voice breaking. "Every time I look at Noah, I'm terrified. I can't shake this feeling that I'm going to hurt him." His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I knew he'd been distant, but I hadn't realized just how deeply his fears ran. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "What do you mean?" I asked gently, trying to understand. That's when he opened up about something he'd never told me before. When Lucas was 10 years old, he had accidentally dropped his baby cousin while holding him. The baby had cried, but his family reassured him it was fine. Later, though, the cousin developed complications, and even though no one ever directly blamed Lucas, he had carried the guilt ever since. "I've spent my whole life convincing myself it wasn't my fault," he said, his voice shaking. "But now, every time I see Noah, all I can think about is that day. What if I mess up again? What if this time it's worse?" Hearing that broke my heart. I could see the pain etched on his face, the weight he'd been carrying all these years. It wasn't that he didn't love Noah. He was just paralyzed by fear. I told him he didn't have to go through this alone. I suggested he talk to someone, a therapist maybe, who could help him unpack everything he'd been holding inside. At first, he resisted. He said he didn't need therapy, that he just needed more time. But I wasn't letting it go. "Lucas, this isn't just about you anymore," I said. "This is about our family, about Noah." Eventually, he agreed to give it a try. He promised he would call and make an appointment, though I wasn't sure if he'd actually follow through. Still, it was a small step, and I clung to it like a lifeline. The following week, he had his first session. When he came home afterward, he was quieter than usual, but there was something different in his demeanor. A sense of relief, maybe, like he'd finally let go of a tiny piece of the burden he'd been carrying. He didn't say much about the session, but he did tell me it was harder than he'd expected. "It's like ripping open an old wound," he said. "But I think it might help." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But even with therapy, Lucas was still keeping his distance from Noah. He'd sit in the same room while I fed or played with him, but he wouldn't join in. I tried to be patient, reminding myself that healing takes time. But it was hard. I felt like I was carrying the weight of everything. Parenting, the household, and now Lucas's emotional struggles on my shoulders. Some days it felt like too much. And yet, I couldn't give up. Not on Lucas, and definitely not on Noah. All I could do was hope that therapy would help Lucas find his way back to us. The next few weeks were a roller coaster. Lucas started attending therapy regularly, but the changes were slow, painfully slow. He seemed lighter after some sessions, like he'd left a small part of his burden behind in the therapist's office. Other times he came home quiet and withdrawn, retreating into himself in a way that made my chest ache. He wasn't pushing me away outright, but he wasn't letting me in either. Meanwhile, I was drowning. The days felt endless, feeding Noah, changing diapers, calming him when he cried. I was doing everything, and the weight of it was crushing. I told myself Lucas was trying, that he was making progress, but I couldn't shake the resentment building inside me. I missed my husband. I missed feeling like a team. One evening, Lucas came home from therapy and said his therapist wanted me to join a session. I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Part of me was nervous, afraid of what I might hear, but another part was hopeful. Maybe this would finally help us reconnect. Maybe we could start to bridge the gap between us. The session was harder than I expected. Lucas opened up about how he felt like he was failing, not just as a father, but as a husband too. I feel like I'm letting everyone down, he said, his voice cracking. Every time I look at Noah, I feel this overwhelming fear that I'm going to ruin everything. And then I look at you, Emma, and I see how strong you are, how much you're doing, and it just makes me feel even worse. His words hit me like a ton of bricks. I had been so focused on my own struggles that I hadn't fully understood how deep his pain ran. But at the same time, hearing him admit how much he was struggling made me feel hopeful. For the first time in months, it felt like we were on the same side, fighting the same battle. After that session, things started to shift, slowly but noticeably. Lucas began spending more time in the same room as Noah and me. He still wasn't holding him, but he'd sit on the couch while I fed him or play with him from a safe distance. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Then, one night, something changed. I was sitting on the couch feeding Noah when Lucas came over and sat down next to me. He didn't say anything at first, just watched quietly. After a few minutes, he took a deep breath and said, "Can I hold him?" I froze. For months I'd been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, I didn't know what to do. I nodded and carefully handed Noah over to him. Lucas's hands were trembling as he cradled him, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he held him close, his eyes filling with tears. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have done this sooner." Watching Lucas hold Noah for the first time felt like a breakthrough, not just for him, but for us as a family. It wasn't perfect, and I knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. But just as I started to believe things were getting better, life threw another curveball at us. Lucas began pulling away again, not from Noah this time, but from me. He stopped joining me for therapy sessions, saying he needed to focus on his own healing. He stayed late at work more often, and when he was home, he was distracted, buried in his phone or his thoughts. It wasn't like before. He was still making an effort with Noah, changing the occasional diaper or playing with him when he had the energy. But our marriage felt like it was unraveling. We started arguing more, about everything and nothing. It was like all the tension we'd been holding inside for months was finally boiling over. One night, after yet another argument, I broke down. "Lucas, I can't keep doing this," I said through my tears. "I feel like I'm losing you. I feel like I'm doing this alone." His face softened, and for the first time in weeks, he looked at me, not through me, but at me. "I'm trying, Emma," he said quietly. "I really am, but I don't know how to fix this." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to believe him, to trust that he was doing his best, but I was so tired. Tired of carrying the weight of our family on my own. Tired of waiting for things to get better. That night, after Lucas went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the baby monitor. I wanted so badly to believe we could get through this, but for the first time, I started to wonder if we couldn't. What if this was our new normal? What if Lucas never fully came back to us? I didn't have answers. All I knew was that I couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change, and soon. The night I sat alone in the living room, staring at the baby monitor, something shifted in me. I realized I couldn't keep putting all my energy into saving Lucas if it meant losing myself in the process. I needed help too, and I needed to stop pretending I could handle everything on my own. The next morning I called Chloe and told her everything. She listened quietly, then said, "Emma, you've been trying to save Lucas this whole time, but who's saving you? You need someone to lean on too. Talk to someone, for yourself." It was hard to admit, but she was right. I started seeing a counselor a week later. At first, I wasn't sure what to say. My life felt like a puzzle I couldn't solve. I told the therapist about Noah, about Lucas, about the crushing weight of trying to hold my family together. She didn't offer magical solutions, but she listened, and that alone felt like a lifeline. Meanwhile, Lucas's progress was slow. He still went to therapy, but his engagement with me felt strained. He'd have moments of connection, like when he played with Noah or asked me about my day, but they were fleeting. It felt like he was trying to come back to us, but something was still holding him back. Then one day, out of nowhere, Lucas's mom called me. She said she wanted to talk, but not in front of Lucas. I agreed to meet her at a cafe the next morning, unsure of what to expect. When we sat down, she looked at me with a mixture of sadness and guilt. "Emma, "There's something you need to know about Lucas," she began. "It's about what happened with his cousin." I froze. This was the event Lucas had carried with him for years, the reason he was so afraid of holding Noah. I nodded, urging her to go on. She explained that Lucas's cousin had a pre-existing medical condition, something the family never told him about. The complications the baby developed weren't caused by the fall. "Lucas wasn't to blame," she said softly, "but no one ever told him that. He's been carrying that guilt for nothing." Her words hit me like a tidal wave. Lucas had spent his entire life blaming himself for something that wasn't his fault. It explained so much, his fear, his distance, his deep-seated anxiety. But now I had a choice to make. Do I tell him, or do I let him uncover it on his own in therapy? I wrestled with it for days before deciding he needed to know. That night, after Noah went to bed, I sat Lucas down and told him what his mom had said. At first, he just stared at me, his face blank. Then slowly, tears filled his eyes. "Are you sure?" he whispered. I nodded. "She told me everything. Lucas, it wasn't your fault. It never was." He broke down then, sobbing in a way I'd never seen before. Years of guilt poured out of him, and I sat there holding his hand, letting him process it. It was a breakthrough, but it wasn't the magic fix I'd hoped it might be. Lucas brought it up in therapy the next week, and his therapist helped him start unpacking the years of guilt and shame he'd carried. It was a step in the right direction, but even with this new information, the road ahead was still rocky. There were moments of progress. Lucas started spending more time with Noah, holding him more often and even helping with feedings. But there were setbacks too. Days when his anxiety crept back in, when he retreated into himself and left me feeling more alone than ever. The breaking point came a few weeks later. It was a chaotic day. Noah had a fever, the bills were piling up, and I was running on 2 hours of sleep. I called Lucas, desperate for help, but he didn't pick up. He was on a work trip and hadn't checked in all day. That night, sitting in the ER with Noah in my arms, I realized I couldn't keep doing this alone. I loved Lucas, but I needed him to step up, or I wasn't sure our marriage would survive. When Lucas came home a few days later, he looked shattered. The first thing he did was apologize for not being there. "I should have answered," he said, his voice full of regret. "I'm so sorry, Emma." But his apology wasn't enough this time. After we put Noah to bed, I told Lucas the truth. "I've been thinking about separation," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't keep doing this on my own. I need you, Lucas, but I need you to really be here. Not just for Noah, but for me too." The words hung heavy in the air. Lucas stared at me, his face pale. For a moment I thought he might not respond at all, but then he said, "I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose our family." It was the most vulnerable I'd ever seen him. He admitted he'd been using work to escape, that he was terrified of failing us and didn't know how to fix it. For the first time, it felt like he truly understood the impact his distance had on me. The next day, Lucas made a decision that surprised me. He asked his boss for an extended leave from work, saying he needed to focus on his family and his mental health. It was a bold move, and it gave me hope that he was finally ready to make real changes. He also committed to an intensive therapy program, one that focused not just on his past trauma, but on his role as a father and a husband. For the first time, he asked me to join him for some sessions. It felt like a step toward rebuilding not just his relationship with Noah, but our marriage too. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were moving forward, together. The days that followed Lucas's decision to take leave from work were different. There was a shift, not huge, but noticeable. He was more present, both physically and emotionally. He started waking up early to help with Noah's feedings, and he spent time playing with him, even if it was just for a few minutes. It felt like he was finally trying, really trying. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel so alone. Lucas also threw himself into his therapy program. It wasn't just about unearthing his childhood trauma anymore. It was about learning how to cope with the fears and anxieties that had been holding him back as a father. He came home from one session and told me, "I realized today that I've been so scared of failing that I never gave myself the chance to even try." Hearing that hit me hard. For so long, I'd been carrying the weight of his fears without understanding how much heavier they must have been for him. I could see now that Lucas wasn't just avoiding Noah out of neglect. He was avoiding him because he didn't think he deserved to be his dad. But slowly, he was starting to let go of that belief. One afternoon, something incredible happened. Noah had been practicing pulling himself up, and out of nowhere, he took his first wobbly steps. Lucas and I were both sitting on the floor, and when Noah stumbled into Lucas's arms, it was like watching a wall come down. Lucas scooped him up, his face filled with emotion, and for the first time, he held Noah without hesitation. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away, he just held him, and I could see how much it meant to him. That moment felt like a turning point for us as a family. Lucas was finally connecting with Noah, not just as a baby, but as his son. And while I knew there were still challenges ahead, I finally felt like we were moving in the right direction. But life wasn't perfect, and healing wasn't linear. There were still setbacks. Lucas had days when his fears crept back in, when he'd retreat into himself, and I had to remind him that it was okay to lean on me. We also had to navigate the financial strain of him being on leave. Therapy bills were piling up, and with only one steady income, money was tight. We made cuts where we could, canceling subscriptions, eating out less, but the stress was always in the back of my mind. I started going to therapy more regularly too. It was something I hadn't realized I needed until I started doing it. My counselor helped me see that I couldn't pour from an empty cup. I had to take care of myself, not just for Noah and Lucas, but for me. I began carving out time for myself. Coffee dates with Chloe, short walks in the park, even just reading a book while Noah napped. It wasn't much, but it helped me feel like myself again. Lucas and I also started attending marriage counseling together. Those sessions were tough, sometimes brutally so, but they forced us to confront the resentment and pain that had built up between us. For the first time, Lucas truly opened up about how isolated he'd felt, not just since Noah was born, but long before that. And I shared how his distance had made me feel abandoned, like I was carrying our family on my own. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Slowly, we started rebuilding the trust that had been chipped away over the months. Then one evening, as we were sitting on the couch after Noah had gone to bed, Lucas turned to me and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." His voice was quiet, but his words carried so much weight. "I know I made it hard, and I know I hurt you, but I'm so grateful you stayed." I didn't know what to say. I just leaned into him, letting the weight of his words settle. It wasn't that I hadn't thought about leaving. There were moments when it felt like the only option. But hearing him acknowledge how hard it had been, hearing him say those words, made me realize how far we'd come. As the weeks turned into months, things slowly started to feel normal again. Lucas wasn't perfect, none of us were, but he was present. He was trying. He still had therapy, and he still had moments where the weight of his past tried to pull him down, but he didn't let it consume him anymore. And I didn't feel like I was walking this road alone. One evening, as I watched Lucas reading to Noah before bed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't that everything was fixed, or that our struggles were behind us. It was that we were facing them together now. We were a team again, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed we were going to be okay. Story 2. For as long as I can remember, my relationship with my 28-year-old elder brother has been tumultuous. I am a 25-year-old woman. He was always viewed as the ideal child growing up, incapable of doing any wrong, regardless of how much wrong he committed. In the meantime, I was the reserved one, the one who was disregarded and undervalued. Particularly following the disaster. I had restricted movement in my right leg after a strange playground accident when I was 7 years old. Although I can walk, I limp, and anything that needs physical exertion necessitates extra work and modifications. My brother thought it was amusing right away. It started out with little barbs, such as calling me hop along or mimicking my limp. I assumed he would get over it, but as we grew older, his jokes got more scathing and cruel. And the worst part? My family always dismissed it as harmless banter. My relatives, uncles, and parents would laugh and shake their heads. "That's only him, I see. Don't let it affect you," they would say. I made an effort to ignore it, but it drained me. When the people who ought to support you make you feel like you're overreacting because you've been hurt, it's difficult to remain strong. A prime example was the most recent family meal. When our family went trekking last year, my brother was in full swing, making loud jokes about how I required special accommodations. For laughter, he exaggerated my limp and imitated me begging for assistance on a path. As if it were a comedy performance, everyone at the table laughed along. My dad even gave him a pat on the back, as if he had just cracked the greatest joke ever. I pretended the mashed potatoes on my plate were the most intriguing thing in the world, while I sat there with my cheeks burning. For some reason, that moment stayed with me, even though it wasn't the first time, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. Perhaps it was the way, after laughing, my mother looked at me as if to challenge me to speak. Perhaps it was simply the sheer fatigue of constantly being the target of jokes when I arrived home that evening. I let myself stew and started my small flat. I'm frustrated, not depressed. I'm not weak. For me, I have created a life. I've managed do-it-yourself projects, learned to swim, and even established a strong profession in software development despite my impairment. I quote V. Put a lot of effort into building a self-sufficient, satisfying existence, but my brother and consequently my family were unable to look past my limp. That evening, I made the decision to stop allowing them to define who I am. I called Olivia, my best friend, first thing in the morning. She has been my pillar of support for years, and she didn't mince words when I told her what had happened. She stated, "You don't need their approval. Pay attention to yourself. Give them a taste of what they are missing." I made the identical decision to do it. I began by making my residence more accessible, a project I had been thinking about for a long. There was a time when my brother made a joke about my apartment being like an obstacle course for people with disabilities. He wasn't incorrect, even though I detested the way he delivered it. It was a challenge to me. Over the following few weeks, I started working after researching ideas and placing an internet order for materials. I rearranged furniture, made specialized ramps, and even installed an automatic door system. It wasn't simple. I spent more nights buried in sawdust than I'd care to admit, and I had to learn a lot of new skills. However, the outcomes were worthwhile. I felt like I owned my flat for the first time. I had a breakthrough at work around the same time. I had been fighting for and didn't think I would be given the opportunity to head a significant project until my manager requested me to do so. Despite the enormous burden, I immersed myself into it. After the project was completed satisfactorily, I was given a bonus in addition to a promotion. I felt as though I was finally being thrown a bone by the world. My family realized something was off, of course. I began avoiding my brother completely, missing family dinners, and responding to texts less frequently. My parents began phoning more frequently, encouraging me to speak with him and let the past go. But I didn't back down. Until my brother demonstrated real change, I wasn't going to interact. And up until now, all I'd received were a few caustic messages explaining why he was given the silent treatment. I discovered a new community in the meanwhile. Olivia had been pushing me to join a local adapted sports club for a long time, so I did. Although the first session was nerve-wracking, I ended up making friends who truly understood what it was like to live with a handicap. They were more than simply encouraging. They were motivational. I even developed a talent for wheelchair basketball, something I never imagined I'd like but now find really entertaining. I felt for the first time in a long time that I was creating a life that was independent of my brother and his beliefs. I wasn't attempting to convince him of anything. To myself, I was proving it. And to be honest, nothing felt better than that. According to Update 128, things have been going quickly, but in the greatest possible way. I became aware of how much simpler my life might be when I had control over my surroundings after completing the initial set of changes to my residence. For the first time, I felt like I was making a statement with the automatic door system and bespoke ramps. I was designing an environment that complemented me rather than working against me. Olivia shared a little video showcasing the improvements on social media, comparing the before and after shots. Until the alerts began to come in, I didn't give it any thought. Commenters praised the idea's inventiveness and their potential to assist others facing comparable difficulties. Some even sought guidance on improving accessibility in their own areas. To be honest, it was a little overwhelming and odd. The finest aspect? My brother also witnessed it. Shortly after the video was posted, he texted me. His dismissiveness and sarcasm were usual. It had to do with how I was using it to further my own agenda and how others were only interested in me because I was playing the victim. I didn't answer. When I was finally getting underway, I wasn't going to let him pull me back into his negativity. In the meantime, the large project I've been overseeing at work was coming to a close. Despite the tight schedule, we succeeded, and the client was overjoyed. My boss personally thanked me and informed me of my promotion when they summoned me into their office. Additionally, I was eligible for a bonus, which allowed me to continue updating my flat without using any of my funds. It seemed as though all of the effort was finally paying off. My folks saw that I hadn't been around much recently, of course. They began phoning more frequently to inquire as to why I hadn't returned my brother's SMS or attended Sunday meals. It was not long before the guilt trip began. They wanted me to take charge and make amends with him. I informed them that I had no desire to maintain harmony by acting as though nothing was wrong. My brother had to accept responsibility for his treatment of me if he desired a relationship. They weren't happy about that. They attempted to dispute, but I repeated the same point in a calm, steady voice. Unless there was real responsibility, I wasn't talking to him. For the first time, they didn't resist as strongly, even if they didn't enjoy it. Perhaps they were beginning to notice that I was no longer the quiet person who listened to my brother's remarks at the dinner table. I began going to the weekly meetings of the adapted sports group Olivia had located for me at this point. Admittedly, I was first anxious. They were kind and supportive, but the most of the folks present appeared much more seasoned and self-assured than I was. I soon started playing wheelchair basketball after they showed me the ropes. I'm actually rather excellent at it, or competent enough to compete in a game. I began to look forward to each session, but it was a thrill. As significant as the physical component was the social component. I got to know folks who knew what it was like to live with a handicap. They were more than simply encouraging. They honored everyone regardless of size. Compared to the dynamic I was accustomed to with my family, it seemed quite different. After watching Olivia's film of my apartment improvements, one of my new groupmates recommended that I tell more about my experience. At first, I wasn't sure, but I accepted an invitation to speak at an event from a local adaptive living organization. Standing up there discussing my stories felt empowered, and the occasion was little but significant. Inquiries are insightful, and several people even approached me afterwards to express gratitude for telling my tale. Despite all that was going on, my brother remained loyal to himself. He texted me a couple more nasty things, but I wasn't as bothered by them anymore. I didn't need his approval, and I wasn't going to let his pessimism stop me. A few weeks later, I took part in a local 5-kilometer adapted race, which was one of the most fulfilling experiences. It wasn't simple. After weeks of training and pushing myself beyond my comfort zone, I felt invincible as I crossed the finish line. I was demonstrating to myself that I was capable of doing things that my brother had always claimed were impossible, in addition to disproving him. My mental health has significantly improved when I began reducing the number of family visits. I still communicate with my parents on occasion, but I've made it plain that I'm putting myself first at the moment. For me, the distance has been beneficial. Supportive friends and coworkers who recognize my potential are all around me and encourage me at every turn. In retrospect, I'm amazed at how much has changed in such a short period of time. I once believed that my brother's opinion was important and that I needed his blessing to feel deserving. I see now how foolish that was. I don't need his or anybody else's approval to keep going since my progress speaks for itself. Update. During a family cookout that my parents held, 2 things reached a breaking point. My mom pleaded with me to go, saying it would be a low-key, family-only event, even though I had been avoiding these get-togethers. I consented against my better judgment. I could sense the tension in the room as soon as I stepped in. My parents lingered around, attempting to keep the mood light, while my brother held court as usual, laughing loudly at his own jokes. I stayed on the periphery of the gathering, talking to a relative I hadn't seen in a long time, when my brother suddenly spotted me and came running over. He let out a loud grumble about how my refusal to interact with him was making everyone uneasy. He said that by refusing to let things go, I was creating drama and playing the victim. The backyard fell silent. We had everyone's attention. I didn't speak louder. I didn't flinch at all. I just explained that it wasn't about playing the victim when I established boundaries with him. It was to keep me at ease. He appeared surprised at how calm my tone was. I didn't bite when he stuttered something about how I was overreacting. Instead, he stood there in front of everyone as I turned and left. Later, my cousin drew me aside as I was going to the kitchen to get a drink. She acknowledged that she had always thought his actions were excessive and expressed her pride in me for confronting him. For the first time, a family member publicly recognized what I had been going through for years. I didn't realize how much that little moment of approval mattered. In the meantime, work had been going really well. I was nominated by my supervisor for an industry award that honors creativity and adaptable technology. I'm grateful for the project I oversaw. It was a victory just to get nominated, but I couldn't help but smile when I saw my name on the shortlist when it was announced. I was energized by the acknowledgement, and soon after, I began to see other chances opening up. My brother couldn't leave it alone, of course. During one group text discussion, he began to use passive-aggressive language whenever he had the opportunity. He made a joke about how some individuals were concentrating on things that were truly important rather than fishing for trophies. No one else laughed, and it wasn't subtle. He was obviously attempting to get under my skin, but I didn't answer. I was shocked to see how some members of the family began to change their minds. A few days after the BBQ, my aunt phoned to see how I was doing. She acknowledged that she and a few others had been discussing it and concurred that my brother's actions had become excessive. Although it wasn't a whole family intervention, it seemed like a step in the right direction. I reached a significant fitness milestone around this time. I quote, "We've been training consistently since the 5K, and I finally finished one of the adapted sports challenges I've been working on with a personal best. Although it was a little victory, it fueled the flames. My story was even included in the local media, which covered my support of adaptable living. It felt incredible to see my picture printed with a headline that praised my accomplishments. Naturally, my brother didn't take it well. In our family group chat, he lost it and accused me of attempting to discredit me and get attention. The rest of the family didn't pay attention to him, but I did. A few family members resisted, begging him to quit being so resentful and give me the opportunity. Like some sort of theatrical departure, he hurried out of the chat, leaving a trail of emojis in his wake. I made the decision to begin treatment while all of this was going on. I wanted to process things in a healthy way since the years of derision and rejection had worn me down. My therapist assisted me in seeing the extent to which my brother's remarks had ingrained themselves into my perception of myself. For the first time, I began to let go of the notion that I needed to feel worthy in order to get his or anybody else's favor. Motivated by this fresh viewpoint, I started organizing something I had been too scared to attempt for years: an individual journey. My brother used to make fun of me for even thinking of going alone, claiming that I couldn't last a day without assistance, even though I had always fantasized of doing so. I didn't ask for anyone's opinion this time. I began looking at places to visit and determining how to modify the trip to accommodate my demands. It was freeing to think of seeing the world as I saw fit. The ultimatum followed. In a lengthy, meandering text, my brother demanded a face-to-face meeting to resolve the matter. He maintained that without working things out, we couldn't proceed. I informed him that I was amenable to a discussion, but only if he would be prepared to honor my limits and approach it with sincere responsibility. His answer: silence on the radio. That quiet said a lot. It strengthened my resolve to prioritize myself and not let his pessimism to rule my life. I felt more determined than ever as I planned my trip and anticipated the prospects that were ahead. I had given up trying to disprove him. I wanted to prove myself correct. Update 3. I had dreamed of going on a solo journey for years, but I had never dared to do it because of all the worries my family, especially my brother, had sown. It took me weeks to finalize my itinerary and a lot of second guessing. A national park known for its beautiful trails and ease of entry. I looked into renting adapted equipment, planned out transportation, and reserved an accessible accommodation. I felt like I was getting closer to realizing that I couldn't accomplish this alone with each step. Olivia's helpful advice on preparing, navigating new areas, and being safe was invaluable. She even assisted me in getting used to taking public transportation, something I had avoided for years due to concerns about accessibility. I felt as ready as I could be by the time the day of travel arrived. Naturally, my folks weren't overjoyed. The previous evening, they gave me a call, voice and worries regarding my alone travels. My mother continued saying the same things my brother used to say, including that it was too risky and that I should wait till I had a companion. Despite their skepticism, I reassured them as courteously as possible. It wasn't about him or them on this journey. When the time finally arrived, I prepared my belongings, took a quick social media snapshot and left. I received a very nice reaction from my followers, the most of whom had become my followers following Lydia's video of my apartment improvements. People were sending me messages wishing me luck and encouraging me. It seemed like a modest yet impactful farewell. The bus ride to the park went off without a hitch on the first flight. I started talking to Claire, a woman who was also traveling alone and who, like me, had encountered her share of difficulties. It was also her first time traveling alone, and she was in a wheelchair. We linked right away and shared tales about the challenges we had faced and our travel objectives. We had already swapped numbers and made plans to meet again later that week by the time we got to the park. I went exploring as soon as I was comfortable in my cabin. I was able to navigate the trails much more easily since I had borrowed an adapted trekking pole and a lightweight leg brace. I took on a somewhat challenging path that I had been eyeing since my research period on the second day. It wasn't simple. I continued despite the rough routes and steep parts. It seemed like the world was on top of you as you arrived at the viewpoint at the finish. A park ranger started talking to me while I was lying there. She asked if she may snap a picture for the park's social media page after being impressed by the work I did. Although I didn't give it much thought at the time, I agreed, and the post became viral on the internet. My phone was ringing with alerts from folks who had commented on how inspirational the tale was by the time I returned to my cabin. My brother, of course, had to add his voice. He implied that I was starving for attention in a sarcastic text he sent me regarding my self-promotion. I didn't respond. I choose to ignore his criticism by reading the encouraging remarks left by both friends and complete strangers. Claire and I got together again for a simpler path on the third day. We ended up discussing our experiences, from the minor triumphs to the more significant setbacks, for the most of the afternoon. She urged me to contact with her team when I returned home, mentioning that she worked in adaptive technology. The prospect of working together on something worthwhile seemed like an added bonus to a journey that was already life-changing. By the end of the week, I had achieved more than I had imagined. I managed to get through a whole day's worth of tasks without help. Setting up my equipment, climbing a challenging slope, or simply taking in the tranquility of the wilderness, all of which my brother had always claimed I couldn't manage, felt like evidence of how far I'd come. I paused at the cabin window to watch the sunset on my final night there. There was more to the journey than demonstrating anything to anybody. I'd been trying to prove it to myself. I didn't require the affirmation of my parents or the acceptance of my sibling. At last, I was capable, self-sufficient, and living my life as I saw fit. I told Olivia and a few pals about the trip's highlights when I arrived home. They were ecstatic for me, and Claire even followed up to inquire about the possibility of working together. However, when I brought up the vacation, my parents were apprehensive. I didn't press them, even though I could tell they were suppressing their reservations. It was not their adventure, but mine. The finest aspect? I didn't feel the urge to check my phone to see what my brother or anybody else thought for the first time. The true turning point was realizing that this vacation had been for me. The idea that I need approval from someone who had never trusted me in the first place was something I had formally abandoned. I didn't suggest the update for the family gathering, but my parents insisted. One evening, they contacted and said it was time for the family to come to a consensus. They persisted, even though my immediate reaction was to say no. I finally consented to go on one condition after some back and forth. Everyone would have an opportunity to speak, there would be ground rules, and there would be no interruptions or condescending remarks. Even though I could see my brother wasn't excited about the prospect, my parents grudgingly consented. There was tension in the air when I got to their house. My brother was slouching on the couch, carelessly browsing through his phone. My dad was sitting quietly in the corner, and my mom was pacing around anxiously, offering everyone beverages and food. Determined to maintain my calm, I inhaled deeply and sat down. Awkwardly, the meeting began. By expressing their desire for everyone to get along once more, my parents attempted to introduce it gradually. When it was my turn to talk, I remained composed, despite my brother rolling his eyes and grumbling that this was all a waste of time. I gave a direct and concise explanation of everything. I described how I had been harmed by his years of continuous ridicule, provide concrete examples to eliminate any possibility of misinterpretation. I also discussed how it had been more difficult for me to defend myself because of the family's propensity to ignore his actions. My brother was leaning back in his chair with his arms folded and a smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth while I was speaking. He went into full denial mode once I was done. He said that I was overly sensitive, that he had never meant anything bad, and that I should have laughed it off like everyone else. For the first time, he even accused me of fabricating things to make him the villain. Neither of my parents immediately defended him. Rather, my dad actually said something, suggesting that perhaps my brother's jokes had gone too far, and my mom seemed uneasy. A look of rage distorted my brother's face. He began to yell, saying that everyone was banding together against him. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him before anybody could say anything more. The atmosphere changed once he departed. My dad shocked me by apologizing in private, but my mom appeared upset. He acknowledged that rather than ignoring the situation, he ought to have intervened years ago. Hearing those words felt like a minor win, even if it wasn't a complete settlement. In the weeks after the gathering, I never heard from my brother. To be honest, I didn't mind, even if it seemed like he had chosen to punish me with quiet. I poured myself into therapy, concentrating on re-establishing my boundaries and regaining my sense of self-worth. Every session felt like removing a fresh layer of the long-held self-doubt. In the meantime, I was working on a project with Claire, a fellow traveler I had met on my own journey. I was asked to join her team as a consultant for a cutting-edge adaptive technology project. The work was demanding, but worthwhile, and it was incredible to be a part of something that had the potential to truly impact people's lives. At about the same time, I received an invitation to give a speech about overcoming obstacles and living with disabilities at a nearby school. I was reminded of why advocacy had taken on such a significant role in my life by the students' active participation and intelligent questions. My journey wasn't the only one. Helping others realize what was possible was the goal. However, not every member of the family was on board. Some extended family members began to mutter that I was exaggerating and making a huge deal out of nothing. For the sake of maintaining family harmony, one even advised me to simply let it go. I refrained from arguing. I just informed them that I had had enough of compromising my tranquility to ensure the family's comfort. I felt calmer than I had in years, even though the tension was still there. My life was developing in unexpected ways. My social circle was stronger than ever. My work was fulfilling, and I was no longer burdened with trying to win my brother's approval. Even though the family was split up, I felt whole for the first time. I wasn't living to please other people. I was leading a genuine life, and that was sufficient. Update 5. My brother sent me a lengthy, unexpected text message a few weeks following the family gathering. It felt more like a face-saving tactic than an apology, but it was his version of one. He admitted that he might have gone too far, but he soon turned his attention to accusing our parents of failing to intervene sooner. "I hope we can move on and put this behind us," he wrote at the end of the message. It took me a while to respond. When I did reply, I realized that reconciliation would take more than a nebulous apology. I told him I needed to see genuine accountability and long-term change, not just words. His response? Silence. Around the same time, things at work had an all-time high. The project I'd been consulting on with Claire's team was not only a success, but also earned me an industry accolade for my contributions to adaptive technology. The award ceremony was surreal. Standing on stage, I felt proud of the work we'd done, knowing it could make a real difference in people's lives. Not long after, I was invited to deliver a keynote speech at a major event on accessibility and innovation. The audience was larger than I'd ever imagined, and as I wrapped up my talk, the standing ovation caught me completely off guard. The recognition was overwhelming in the best way. The moment wasn't without its challenges, though. My brother caught wind of the speech through a family group chat where my parents had proudly shared the news. He made a snide remark about me enjoying the spotlight and joked about how he'd have to take up a new hobby to keep up. This time, no one laughed. My parents didn't respond to his comments, and the silence from the rest of the family spoke volumes. Privately, my parents reached out to express their pride. They told me they were impressed by how far I'd come, and assured me they supported the boundaries I'd set with my brother. It felt like a shift, a small but significant step toward realigning the family dynamic. Meanwhile, Claire and I had been staying in touch. What started as a casual friendship grew deeper as we collaborated on more projects and shared stories about our personal lives. She became someone I could rely on, and our bond felt like one of the most natural parts of my journey. The recognition for my speech and the award didn't stop there. A community magazine reached out to feature me, and a profile about local advocates making a difference. The article highlighted not just my professional achievements, but also my advocacy work and personal story. Seeing my journey laid out like that was a moment of reflection. It showed me just how far I'd come amid all this. My brother made another awkward attempt at reconciliation. He sent me a message asking if I wanted to grab a coffee and catch up. The invitation felt half-hearted, like he was checking a box rather than genuinely trying to mend things. I declined, citing a busy schedule. I didn't shut the door completely, but I made it clear that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent effort. Setting those boundaries wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I wasn't angry with him anymore, just focused on protecting my peace. Therapy had helped me understand that forgiveness didn't mean tolerating toxic behavior, and I was finally putting that lesson into practice. My parents also started making adjustments. They began attending family therapy sessions, something I never thought I'd see. They told me they wanted to better support both of their children and address the enabling behaviors that had caused so much tension over the years. Knowing they were making an effort gave me a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. The last win came in the form of a challenge. I'd been prepping for a hard-adapted marathon. It was something my brother had previously derided as impossible, but I practiced for months, determined to prove him and myself wrong. The race was grueling, pushing me to my limits, but crossing the finish line was worth every second of struggle. The throng, applause, and the feeling of success were unlike anything I'd experienced before the marathon finish. Even gained the notice of the local press, who featured me in a piece on overcoming hurdles. Messages of encouragement flooded in from friends, co-workers, and even strangers who had followed my journey. As I looked back on everything, my brother's words, the family gathering, the milestones I had attained, I realized something crucial. I didn't need his affirmation or approval anymore. My power, my triumphs, and my peace come from inside, not from anybody else's ideas. For the first time, I felt entirely free. My journey wasn't about proving my brother wrong. It was about demonstrating to myself that I was capable of anything. And I had Story 3. I was never the favorite growing up. My older sister, Amelia, 31, has always been the center of attention, and I am currently 29. It was disastrous if I dropped a plate, if Amelia caused any damage. She didn't mean it, but accidents can happen. In my family, it was the way it was. She always held a special place in my parents' hearts. In the meantime, I was held responsible for all mishaps. However, as we grew older, what began as minor issues became into something far more sinister. Amelia began using cunning to make me the fall guy when I was approximately 8 years old. She once stole a $20 note I had been saving for Christmas after sneaking into my room. She then informed our parents she saw me stealing it from my mom's pocketbook and shoved it into my bag. They believed her, of course. Why wouldn't they? After all, I was the one causing the issue. After finding the money in my baggage, Mom grounded me for a month. Until Amelia laughed at me and remarked, "You're too easy." I had no idea how it got there. These setups became commonplace. Lunch money was taken and bases were broken, failing to do assignments. If only Amelia could blame me. She did. She was an expert at gaslighting by the time we were teenagers. She would manufacture disputes in which she would remain collected and quiet while I, irritated and perplexed, would yell. That was not the case. Naturally, this gave the impression to my parents that I struggled with anger management. Amelia has remained the same as she enters maturity. She has, if anything, become worse. She is skilled at fabricating tales that portray me as the insane attacker and her as the naive victim. Amelia made up the tale of my blowing up at her over something insignificant at a family cookout a few years back. By the end of the night, my mother was staring at me as if I had just kicked a dog, even though it had never occurred. However, the most recent episode was the final straw. We held a family get-together at my parents' place a few months ago. I believed everything went smoothly. I avoided getting close to Amelia, helped clean up after supper, and never raised my voice. However, my mother called me the next day. She was furious and said that Amelia informed her that I had a breakdown and yelled at her without cause. Amelia apparently felt unsafe remaining in the house that night since she was so upset. This did not occur. There was not a word. But once more, my folks didn't challenge her. They stopped answering my calls after that. I was blocked on social media by my dad. I received a lengthy text from my mother telling me that I needed to focus on myself and get therapy for my anger. It was embarrassing. I made an effort to defend myself, but they didn't care about anything I said. The saddest aspect is that Amelia's word is gospel. My parents weren't the last. Recently, my cousin Sophia contacted me to let me know that she had received word from Amelia that I was seriously unstable and in need of expert assistance. Amelia has been telling everyone who would listen about this story. I have no control over her portrayal of me as a ticking time bomb. A few towns over, I now live alone in a little apartment. I have a few close friends who know who I really am, and I have a reliable job. During all of this, they have been my pillar of support, particularly while my family continues to distance themselves. However, having to keep defending myself to others and not being the monster Amelia portrays me as is tiresome. It feels like I'm waging a battle with all the weaponry on the other side and I'm just standing there with nothing. Trying to find out where it all went wrong, I was going over my old texts with Amelia a few nights ago. I became aware of trends at that point. There were instances when she made mistakes and unintentionally acknowledged her lies, as well as moments when she contradicted herself. I began storing emails, taking screenshots, and putting everything in a folder. I would provide evidence if no one was going to trust me on my word. Getting my name cleared is no longer the only goal. Regaining my life is the goal. According to my relative, Amelia has been informing others that I pose a risk to both myself and other people. It's more than simply a falsehood. Defamation is what it is. I made the decision that I would no longer allow her to destroy me. She can play dirty if she wants to. All right, but I'm retaliating this time. I've already begun to record everything. Every voicemail, text, every conversation I have with my family. For the times when I have to interact with Amelia face to face, I'm also considering purchasing a recording device. My friends are encouraging and even advise that if the need arises, I see a lawyer. One even made the joke that I ought to create a book that tells all about surviving a sister psychopath. Then, as if in a flashback, I recalled something from our childhood. Amelia had persuaded my parents that I was pilfering money from their wallets when I was 14 years old. Naturally, I wasn't, but I recall asking myself at the time, how can I prove that I didn't do something? I feel just like that right now. However, I have a strategy this time. Communicating with my parents one final time in an attempt to reach them is the first step. I'm going public if it doesn't work. Although I have no idea where this will go, I do know one thing. I will no longer remain silent. Following my last article, I made the decision to take charge of the issue and stop being reactive. Amelia had been in charge of the story for years, but I was determined to use hard, unbiased facts to change it. Preparation was the first step. I purchased a tiny, discreet recording gadget online that would fit neatly in my pocket. Although it wasn't inexpensive, I reasoned that it would be well worth the money if it could catch Amelia in the act. I was aware that my word alone was no longer sufficient. Humans trust what they hear and see. I also need evidence. After setting it up, I contacted my cousin Sophie. Despite being close to Amelia, she is one of the few family members that still communicates with me. She could be aware of Amelia's recent remarks about me, I reasoned. Sophie was hesitant when we initially met, but when I told her everything that had been happening, she acknowledged that Amelia had been boasting about how simple it was to hurt my reputation. The word she used was that. Simple. Sophie acknowledged that Amelia had been circulating rumors about me losing it at family gatherings, but she didn't seem totally at ease with the situation. She said that even distant relatives have been acting strangely around me because Amelia had been telling others that I need professional treatment. I realized after that talk that I needed to arrange myself better. I saved screenshots and organized them into folders as I dug through old emails, texts, and anything else I could locate. Although it took a lot of time, it felt like progress. I discovered emails in which Amelia played the victim after obviously starting a fight, texts in which she attempted to guilt trip me, and exchanges in which she contradicted herself. Everything was there, in black and white. Unintentionally, the next puzzle piece fell into place. Amelia and I met up at a mutual friend's birthday celebration a few days later. I nearly fled when I saw her since I had no idea she would be there. But then I saw that this was a chance. I stayed and switched on the recording gadget in my pocket. Amelia came over to me right away. She was wearing that arrogant expression. When she is in control, she always gets that one. She made a few nasty remarks, sharp enough that I knew precisely what she was doing, but subtle enough that anyone listening may assume she was simply making jokes. She then remarked something like, "It doesn't matter what you say," as if to add insult to injury. I quote, "am believed by everyone, but you." I didn't answer. Knowing that every word was being recorded, simply let her speak. I began seeing hazy, dramatic posts on Amelia's social media after the party. Similar things. Dealing with toxic individuals who are incapable of accepting responsibility for their actions is draining. And no matter how much assistance they receive, some individuals will never change. Naturally, She didn't mention names, but it was clear that she was referring to me. She never does. Keeping things ambiguous enough that no one can directly criticize her is part of her strategy. Then I received an unexpected call from an aunt I hadn't spoken to in months. She inquired about my well-being at the beginning of the conversation, but it soon evolved into her voicing concerns about my mental health. She had apparently been speaking with Amelia as well. I had no idea how far the lies had spread. I made the decision to test Amelia at that point. I told Sophie that I was thinking of accepting a job out of state, knowing that she would relay it to Amelia. I pretended that I had already begun packing. As expected, my mother called me in a rage the following day. Despite the fact that we hadn't spoken for weeks, which proved it, she accused me of being self-centered for arranging to move without consulting the family. The phony story was almost immediately leaked by Amelia. I began to see a pattern in Amelia's behavior as I dug deeper. It was more than just me. She also lied about other aspects of her life. She claimed to hold a high-ranking position at work on social media. However, I recalled that she had complained about not getting promoted last year. She also shared pictures from a business trip, which I believe were taken while she was on vacation with her friends. The more I observed, the more I understood that lying wasn't merely a strategy she used. It was a way of life. Feeling emboldened, I decided to consult a lawyer. I wasn't sure if Amelia's actions could be considered defamation, but I wanted to know my options. The lawyer was cautious, saying defamation cases are tricky, but she agreed that I had a strong case if I could prove Amelia's lies had damaged my reputation. Meanwhile, my Reddit post was gaining traction. The support I received was overwhelming. People shared their own stories of manipulative family members and offered advice on how to gather evidence. Some even suggested going completely no contact with my family, but I wasn't ready for that yet. Not until I exposed the truth. As I worked through my plan, I stumbled upon something big a secret about Amelia that could change everything. I quote, "am not ready to share the details yet, but let's just say this might be the key to turning the tide." Update 2. After my last update, things escalated quickly. The fake story about me moving out of state confirmed Amelia was leaking information. But that was just the beginning. I hadn't expected what came next. Uncovering something that went far beyond her lies about me. It started with Sophie, my cousin. We were chatting again when she mentioned something offhandedly about Amelia helping out my parents financially. That caught my attention because I knew Amelia's job wasn't exactly stable. Sophie went on to explain that Amelia had been telling people she was covering bills for our parents, claiming I wasn't helping at all. She even showed me a screenshot of Amelia complaining to another relative about being the only responsible one dot that didn't sit right with me. Curious, I started digging. My parents are usually private about money, but I remembered seeing my mom's email password written in an old notebook at their house during one of my visits years ago. It was still saved in my notes. I logged into her email and combed through the inbox. I wasn't sure what I was looking for at first, but then I found it a string of messages from Amelia to my parents claiming she needed money for emergencies. There were vague explanations about medical expenses and work-related costs, but they didn't add up. Attached to one email were what looked like fake invoices for a car repair shop and a hospital bill. I Googled the hospital name. It didn't even exist. I compared the dates on the invoices to Amelia's Instagram posts on the day she was supposedly bedridden from a medical emergency. She was posting selfies from a beach vacation that wasn't all. Buried in the emails were bank transfer confirmations. My parents had sent Amelia thousands of dollars over the past 2 years. My stomach dropped. They believed her story so completely that they were financially supporting her, all while she painted herself as their savior to the rest of the family. I compiled everything: the emails, the invoices, and screenshots from her Instagram posts. Then I sent an anonymous email to my parents with the evidence. I didn't include my name, just the facts. Within hours, my mom called me, clearly upset. She accused me of fabricating the documents to get back at Amelia. My dad, on the other hand, was silent during the call, which told me he was starting to piece things together. The next day, I got a message from Sophie. Apparently, my parents confronted Amelia about the email. She denied everything, of course, and spun a wild story about how I must have hacked her accounts to fake the evidence. She even claimed I had been stalking her, which was ludicrous. But here's the kicker. She called half the family trying to discredit me further. She said I was spiraling and needed help. A few relatives messaged me asking if I was okay. It was infuriating, but I kept quiet. I wanted to let her dig her own grave. That opportunity came sooner than expected. Amelia called me, probably trying to provoke me into saying something she could twist. I kept the conversation calm, all while recording it on my device. At one point, she let her guard down and admitted she had borrowed money from my parents, but said it wasn't a big deal because they're fine financially. That recording became the final piece of my growing arsenal of evidence. Meanwhile, I spoke with my therapist about everything that had been happening. She had already been helping me navigate the emotional toll of Amelia's behavior. But this time I asked for something more definite. She consented to write a letter affirming my mental wellness, which clearly contradicted the falsehoods Amelia had been circulating. Armed with proof, I decided to go public. I made an anonymous account and started uploading screenshots of Amelia's falsehoods and manipulations online. I kept out my name and family's information, but the tale immediately gathered traction. People in the comments were surprised, and some even recounted their own experiences with poisonous siblings. The post got viral and quickly extended. Family members began contacting out, apologizing for believing Amelia. This was the turning moment. My parents, especially my dad, started doubting Amelia tales. My mom was still in denial, clinging to the idea that Amelia must have had good intentions. But when other relatives read the posts and came forward with their own suspicions, the holes in Amelia's veneer began to appear. That's when Amelia escalated. She threatened legal action, accusing me of slander. What she didn't know was that I had been consulting a lawyer since the beginning. My attorney warned me that whatever case she attempted to make against me would probably fail, since I had strong proof. The moment of truth then arrived. My parents insisted that it was time to discuss and invited me to join them for a family supper. I was prepared, but Amelia was also present, arrogant as ever. I showed the room all of the recordings, emails, and screenshots while we were eating. It was similar to viewing a film. My father's face became white. My mother was unable to speak. Amelia, too. She snapped. The evidence was strong, notwithstanding her accusation that I set her up. My parents expressed regret at the conclusion of the evening. It wasn't flawless, and I continue to doubt their sincerity. However, it was a beginning. We'll all regret this, Amelia said as she walked away. Amelia's web of deceit had finally come to light, and for the first time in years, the falsehoods were in the open. Update 3. I had assumed that everything would finally calm down after the family supper, where Amelia's falsehoods were revealed. Amelia instead went into overdrive, making every effort to portray herself as the victim. My phone was inundated with messages from extended family in a matter of days. Some were perplexed and wanted to know what was happening. Others were furious, accusing me of planning Amelia's public disgrace. Amelia had been rather busy, it turned out. She spun a fresh story and phoned everybody who would listen. I had orchestrated the entire altercation to ruin her image. To make matters worse, she said I had twisted her emails, hacked into her accounts, and falsified the recordings. I had been stalking her, she added, attending parties without an invitation in order to bother her. Even though it was nearly absurd, it convinced some individuals who were already predisposed to accept her. My mom wasn't so sure, but my dad appeared to see right through her charade. She informed me that Amelia had been sobbing uncontrollably and that I had destroyed her life. Mom continued to hold on to the belief that Amelia would not behave in this manner unless she had a valid cause. Seeing my parents fall into two camps, one beginning to trust me, the other still enchanted by Amelia, was tiresome. A week later, during a cousin's birthday celebration, it finally broke down. Sophie persuaded me that it would be a good opportunity to show the family that I wasn't hiding, even if I hadn't planned to go. Naturally, Amelia was also present. She wasted no time at all. She began to become agitated and accuse me of stalking as soon as she spotted me. I had framed her by hacking her accounts, she informed the crowd, pointing at me. It was anarchy. Knowing that my recorder was running in my pocket, I maintained my composure. Permit her to dig her own tomb. Even other family members who had stood with Amelia began to feel uneasy due to the outrageous claims. I listened to the recording after the party. The dramatic allegations and her tone. Everything was there, but I discovered something much more startling before I could even make up my mind on what to do with it. Amelia sent me messages years ago posing as me when I was reading through old emails. She had sent nasty and derogatory emails to family members in my identity, fabricating whole conversations. That clarifies a lot of the reasons why certain family members had abruptly cut off contact with me. Her fictitious emails included terrifying facts. She even imitated my manner of writing. I emailed my parents this fresh proof after compiling it. Seeing Amelia's trickery for what it was, my dad was incensed, but my mother was hesitant. She asserted that Amelia had to have had a motive for her actions. As though that in some way made it acceptable. She wasn't pushed by me. The evidence was self-evident. Amelia then intensified her threats of legal action. Her attorney accused me of harassment and slander and sent me a cease and desist notice. My lawyer got back to me very away with copies of the evidence we had already collected. There was also a counter threat in the answer. I would sue Amelia for mental anguish and slander if she persisted in her deception campaign. Later, Sophie informed me that Amelia had quietly acknowledged she had no solid case. She was trying to scare me into giving in by threatening legal action. Amelia fell silent for a bit when that didn't work, but I wasn't finished yet. I turned to read it again, frustrated. I included images of emails and recordings with identifying information removed in my in-depth report about all that had transpired. With more than 50,000 upvotes in less than a day, the post became viral. Many people shared their personal experiences with manipulative family members in the comments section. A few even provided guidance on how to handle Amelia's most recent smear effort. However, it didn't end there. Internet detectives began examining Amelia's online activity in the comments section. They pointed out that her work titles appeared to vary based on the social media site, causing contradictions in her tweets. According to a user who claimed to know Amelia, she had lied about advancements and overstated her position at work. Amelia experienced severe issues as a result of this discovery. After word reached her workplace, she was apparently summoned for a meeting to explain her stance. The backlash grew when more family members came across the Reddit post. Some demanded explanations from Amelia over the phone. Others apologized to me for falling for her falsehoods. Amelia's meticulously crafted persona was crumbling, and she was no longer in charge of the story. My mother eventually had to face Amelia. It was hard to ignore the growing facts. Amelia sobbed, saying that I had destroyed her life and that she had only lied because she had been forced into a difficult situation. My mom tried to console her even after my dad warned her to stop making excuses. Even if it was annoying to observe, at least the truth was now known. Being vindicated was satisfying, but the entire process was exhausting. The emotional toll, the incessant calls, and the messages were too much to handle. It was difficult to continue, despite Reddit and my friends' encouragement. I wasn't giving up, though. I was cautious after Amelia's breakdown. This was far from finished. The majority of the family now supports me after Amelia's conduct worsened in the 4th update after my last one. She began to make further false claims, saying that the material I had provided had been made with expert assistance. I had paid someone to access her accounts and make phony emails, she informed anybody who had listened. Amelia has always been skilled at raising doubts, especially in those who were unaware of the whole narrative, even though the premise was ridiculous. Then came the anonymous messages. Burner accounts started sending me emails accusing me of lying manipulatively. Despite their bad writing, I could tell that the texts were from someone who was familiar with the circumstances. Some of them had ambiguous threats to damage my reputation. Who was behind them was easy to figure out, but I needed evidence. I contacted a friend of mine who works there, and with his assistance, we were able to link the emails to an IP address connected to Amelia's home network. I needed validation like that. Equipped with this knowledge, I took notes on everything and stored it away. Knowing that Amelia was probably waiting for a response, I chose not to reply to the messages. A few days later, Amelia did something unexpected. She said in a lengthy message that she wanted to move on from the past and start again. She wrote about how difficult it had been to watch our family fall apart and how much she missed our sibling closeness. I suspected her of having hidden agendas right away since it was so out of character for her, but I went along with it. I made sure to carry my recording equipment to the meeting just in case, and we agreed to meet in a public setting. Amelia tried to move the discussion in the direction of reconciliation by being too amiable, but she made a mistake throughout our conversation. She began ranting about how difficult it had been for her to maintain her composure over the years, and jokingly said that it had been simple to frame me when we were younger. She dismissed it with laughter, claiming that because no one was harmed, it wasn't a huge concern. After the meeting, the entire conversation was taped, and I showed my parents and a few important family members the tape. The easy acknowledgement of guilt in Amelia's tone. There was no denying it. My mom, who had been reluctant to trust me completely, ultimately apologized, and my dad was incensed. Any last uncertainties had been dispelled by hearing Amelia's own remarks. Along with an update on the anonymous remarks and the IP address tracing, I also posted the tape on Reddit. Even more attention was drawn to the discussion than to my earlier post. The extent to which Amelia had gone to defend her falsehoods astounded everyone. Many readers shared similar tales of toxic family members, and the replies were a combination of fear and comfort. Amelia's world quickly began to fall apart. Within a day after the update went public, she erased all of her social media accounts. Even those who made an effort to maintain their neutrality withdrew themselves, and friends and relatives who had previously supported her started to break up their relationships. Although Amelia had always been skilled at managing the story, she no longer had a stage on which to tell her tales. At about the same time, I received a message from a friend of Amelia's. She wanted to share her experiences after seeing the Reddit discussion. She shared screenshots of her talks with Amelia with me, showing me how she used to control their friend group. The trend was the same. Individuals were turning against one another and playing the victim. Additionally, according to this acquaintance, Amelia had taken money from her under false pretenses and never returned it. The fresh proof strengthened Amelia's standing as a manipulator. A tiny portion of the family continued to support Amelia's story, saying she had been bullied into a breakdown, while the majority of the family agreed with me. I chose not to pay attention to them, even though it was annoying. For me, it was sufficient that the truth was known. Amelia knew what she was going to do next. She told certain family members she was going out of town. Most people interpreted her assertion that she needed to leave the poisonous environment and start over someplace else as an attempt to avoid responsibility. Amelia subtly withdrew all of her legal threats against me in the interim. Since Amelia had already lost her reputation, my attorney suggested against filing a slander lawsuit. He said that because I had already won, there was no use in continuing the argument. My parents really apologized for their years of supporting Amelia's actions and for their mistrust of me. I set clear limits, yet they began trying to mend our connection. I will continue to have some communication with them, but I will not permit them to reintegrate Amelia into my life until she accepts full responsibility for her actions. It is unlikely to occur, let's face it. As I think back on everything, I have a peculiar mixture of relief and fatigue. I was continually defending myself against Amelia's manipulations for years, living under the weight of her falsehoods. I can now go on now that the truth is out. The Reddit community has been amazing, sharing their own tales and providing support. Knowing that I'm not alone is reassuring. I intend to keep Amelia out of the picture for the time being. I will not be involved in anything she does next. Update 5. A few months have passed since Amelia's situation blew up, and life seems to be gradually returning to something approaching normal. She hasn't spoken at all. No mysterious messages on social media, no flamboyant phone calls to relatives, nothing. She is keeping a low profile, which makes sense given all that came to light. Based on what I've heard from mutual family members. Even those who took a side with her have turned away. I concentrated on going forward. Therapy has changed my life. I'm now beginning to regain the self-confidence Amelia worked so hard to destroy after my therapist helped me unravel years of manipulation and gaslighting. I've also been putting a lot of effort into my career and getting back in touch with old acquaintances. Spending time with individuals who are aware of my true self, free from the taint of Amelia's falsehoods, is a welcome change from the interactions my parents have been trying to have. They began going to family therapy following the most recent update. The procedure was not simple. Growing up, I had many awkward talks about how their preference for Amelia affected me. However, they are now admitting their part in everything. My dad has been very proactive, expressing his desire to restore trust and offering a clear apology. Despite her ongoing difficulties with guilt for her long-term support of Amelia, my mom is making an effort. Other relatives have also gotten in touch. Many expressed regret for trusting Amelia's claims and acknowledged that they ought to have sought my opinion before accepting her word for it. It's been regrettable. Rebuilding those relationships feels nice, but I can't help but wonder how things could have turned out if they had asked her questions sooner. Nevertheless, I'm going to concentrate on the fact that we're all heading in the correct way at this point. Reddit's assistance has been amazing. One of the finest choices I've ever made was to share my experience online. With addition to assisting with Amelia's exposure, it put me in touch with hundreds of others who had experienced comparable family dynamics. I was able to continue battling because I knew I wasn't fighting alone. Even conversations on toxic relationships and how to handle them started in my direct messages as a result of the viral attention. Seeing how many individuals were motivated to advocate for themselves by my experience has been humbling. I did learn that Amelia was relocating to a different city via a cousin. She seems to be telling folks that she wants to start over and change her ways. I quote, "am not sure if that's genuine or simply another ploy to win people over. To be honest, her decisions no longer have any bearing on me. Therefore, I don't care, and I never imagined having that freedom." Amelia did, however, make one final attempt to get in touch. A few weeks ago, she sent me a mysterious email. It was just partially an apology. It's half a game of blame. She wrote about how difficult life has been and how she hopes I will forgive her in the future. However, she also charged me with intensifying the conflict and entangling the family in needless drama. I didn't respond. Amelia is not welcome in my life until she accepts full responsibility for her conduct, as I have made plain to my parents and everyone else who inquires. I quote, "Mom, not sure if I would want her back even in that case." Without Amelia, family get-togethers have resumed, and to be honest, they feel so much lighter today. Open communication is emphasized, and I've observed my parents trying to involve me in choices and hear my viewpoint. It's not flawless. Although it will take time to repair this much damage, work is being made. I feel like I belong in my own family for the first time in a long time. Recently, a reporter even inquired about doing a story about harmful family dynamics. Even though it seemed alluring, I chose not to go after it. I'm thankful for the platform Reddit provided, but I've already published enough of the narrative online. The past is not something I want to continue living in. I am prepared to move on, now that this chapter is over. In retrospect, the entire ordeal has been a difficult but essential lesson. I now understand the value of self-advocacy, setting boundaries, and following my gut. If something doesn't feel right, it most likely does. And the truth always finds a way to surface, regardless of how much someone tries to change your reality. All you need to do is be prepared to fight for it. To everyone who read my tale, offered guidance, or just showed support, thank you. Even when it seemed like everyone was against me, you reassured me that I wasn't alone. Everything I went through feels worthwhile when I realize that my story empowered others to confront their own toxic family members. I have no idea what the future holds for Amelia, but I'm not accountable for anything she does. I can now concentrate on my own happiness without her shadow hanging over me. This is what I'll leave you with. When someone attempts to change your reality, never question yourself. It's draining. It's annoying and seems unachievable at times. However, the truth will always prevail.